Welcome back. The markets are absolutely flat. I mean, less than 1 point change on the Nifty. We're at about 9,352. The market regulator, SEBI, ushered in a slew of reforms yesterday after their board meeting. This was the SEBI's first board meeting under the chairmanship of Ajay Tyagi. One of the key decisions taken has been the green signal to give options contracts in commodity derivatives trading. Manisha is joining in and she's going to take us through an interesting conversation. Manisha, over to you.
Thank you so much for that, Prashant. Well, yes, we were allowed options, that is the commodity markets were allowed options in September 2016. And yesterday, SEBI has permitted launch of commodity options in commodity derivative markets. Well, we still are awaiting the timeline and the kind of commodities that would be allowed. The settlement, of course, the SEBI chief, as he said, would be converted into derivatives. So the future markets would be underlining for the options that would be launched in the Indian markets. The other, of course, was the integration of broking activities in equity markets and commodity derivative markets under single entity, and that of course has been another positive. The SEBI chief also mentioned that the integration of the exchanges is next on cards after brokers is done. So plenty really seems to be happening into this space. Let's get on board Samir Shah, MD and CEO, NCDEX, to talk more about that. Samir, hi, it's a pleasure to have you. Of course, it does come as a big boost, and the SEBI chief talked about priority being the commodity markets now, on how he wants to broaden that as well. What are your initial reactions to that, and how ready is the exchange to take that all in?
Well, to start with, Manisha, a very positive statement from the SEBI chairman. I mean, it has two, I think, strategic benefits. One is that, of course, the specific permission that is being granted to options is a very, very welcome move. Equally importantly also is the strategic prioritization and the direction setting that the SEBI chairman is giving to the development of commodity markets, which also is equally important, and one must sort of pay heed to that message and take very positive messages out of that directional announcement.
Samir, what's your sense on the volumes that you can, garner because of that? Because the SEBI chief also spoke about on how important it is to integrate the spot and the futures market as well, and that is when perhaps the institutional players would be allowed into this market.
It's too, Manisha, it's too early to comment on specific volumes. But one thing I can say for sure, that because of the way SEBI has designed the options instrument, which is it will result in delivery of the underlying derivative, which means the underlying futures contract, which means that there will be a very strong correlation between the growth in options and growth in futures. So they will support each other's development, and growth in options will result in corresponding growth in the futures market as well. So I think we should be in for some good growth, but it's too early to comment on specific sort of growth target. What is more important is to make sure that we have a safe, risk-free launch by the necessary exchanges under the guidance of SEBI, because it is at the end of the day a new instrument, and we'll have to take one step at a time, make sure that the market awareness is of paramount importance and the risk management is of paramount importance, because the early success will create significant growth in the future. So I would actually prioritize a stable launch rather than a volume-focused launch initially.
For sure. Samir, the SEBI chief also mentioned yesterday, answering a question on whether or not or how soon would the mutual funds or banks be allowed. I mean, he said that allowing the clearing members and brokers is what they're talking with RBI for banks, and the direct, exposure to commodity derivative markets, of course, would come in later. What is your sense on the new entrants, participants, when it comes to this market?
I think there's been a lot of discussion within the Commodity Derivatives Advisory Committee of SEBI, and SEBI seems to have come out with a roadmap of types of participants and the sequencing of the various participants based on the complexity associated with getting them on board. So I think SEBI has got a very clear game plan about how and when it wishes to do things in a very calibrated, well-calibrated manner. I think we should just wait for SEBI's specific announcements on that matter. But it suffices to say at this moment that they seem to have a very well-calibrated, plan in their mind.
Well, absolutely. The SEBI chief actually reiterated that a couple of times yesterday on how it is a priority right now to broaden, strengthen, deepen the commodity markets. Just one final question before we let you go, Samir, and this is about changing your trading timings. What has led to that decision, and do you see an impact or any impact rather on the volumes because of that?
So the change in trading timings is something that we have been representing to even the earlier regulator. Basically, our mission and vision, Manisha, is to align our trading timing with what is required by the the end users of our commodities, which is hedgers, farmers, processors, traders. Between 9 and 9:30 is when all the international sort of correlation has already been fed into the system, into the price discovery. So we don't see any specific need why it should be available till either 11:30 or 11:55 at night, because most of the relevant international price signals have already been factored in, and the domestic industry has already gone to sleep. So there is a balance between factoring in the international price signals and keeping in mind the interests of the domestic industry is what we have done. So this has been a position that we have been taking even with the erstwhile regulator, that it is achieving that balance between international price signals as well as domestic interests, and that is the balance that we have tried to achieve.
Okay. All right, Manisha as well as Samir, thank you very much for joining in and taking us through that conversation. We need to take a break with the news that we're stable for the markets. 93.54 is where the Nifty is at.